Welcome everyone to a deep dive into the life and legacy of a figure whose impact reverberated across the 20th century and continues to shape our understanding of power, revolution, and ideology. We're talking about Vladimir Lenin, a man whose name is synonymous with the Russian Revolution and the birth of the Soviet Union. His story is not just a historical account, it's a profound exploration of how personal tragedy, intellectual conviction, and a relentless will to power can fundamentally alter the course of human events. From his early life, we see the seeds of a revolutionary being sown in unexpected ground. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, as he was born, came into the world on April 22, 1870, in Simbirsk, a provincial Russian city. Now, when you imagine the upbringing of a future revolutionary, you might picture poverty, oppression, or a childhood steeped in radicalism. But Lenin's early life defies that stereotype. His parents, Ilya and Maria Ulyanov, were anything but impoverished or rebellious. They were well-educated, cultured, and dedicated to their children's intellectual and moral development. His father, Ilya, was a former teacher who climbed the civil service ladder to become the director of public schools in the entire Simbirsk province, even earning a title of hereditary nobility. This wasn't a family struggling on the margins. This was a family firmly ensconced in the educated, respectable middle class of Tsarist Russia. His mother Maria was self-educated, fluent in multiple languages, and instilled a love of learning and discipline in her children. The Ulyanov household, by all accounts, was apolitical, a sanctuary of intellectual curiosity, where young Volodya, as he was known, was a bright, energetic, and academically gifted child. He excelled at the Simbirsk Classical Gymnasium, and here's a fascinating historical footnote. The director of that gymnasium was Fyodor Kerensky, the father of Alexander Kerensky, who would, decades later, become Lenin's primary political adversary in 1917. It's almost a preordained clash of titans, isn't it? Two boys, growing up in the same town, under the same educational system, whose paths would diverge so dramatically and then collide in a moment of world-altering revolution. But this tranquil, intellectually stimulating early life was not destined to remain so. Two seismic events shattered Vladimir's world and arguably set him on his revolutionary trajectory. In January 1886, his father died suddenly from a brain hemorrhage. This loss, while significant, was soon overshadowed by a far more devastating blow. Just a year later, in May 1887, his elder brother, Alexander, a university student in St. Petersburg, was arrested. His crime? Participating in a radical terrorist cell that was planning to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. Alexander was tried, convicted, and subsequently hanged. Now, imagine the psychological impact of this on a 17-year-old Vladimir. The loss of a revered older brother, not to illness, but to the state, for a political act. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a public humiliation for the Ulyanov family. They were ostracized by conservative Simbirsk society. This event, more than anything, served as a profound turning point. While Vladimir didn't immediately embrace his brother's terrorist tactics, he actually rejected individual acts of terror as ineffective. The execution deeply politicized him. It instilled in him a quiet, simmering contempt for the Tsarist autocracy, a system that had taken his brother's life and then cast his family out. It was a personal vendetta that intertwined with a burgeoning intellectual critique of the existing order. Shortly after this tragedy, in the autumn of 1887, Vladimir enrolled at Kazan University to study law. But his time there was remarkably brief. Within 3 months, he was expelled for participating in an illegal student protest. This wasn't a small infraction. It was a direct challenge to authority, a sign of his growing radicalization. He was banished to the small village of Kokoshkino, where his family owned a modest estate. And it was in this period of rural isolation, away from the bustling intellectual centers, that Vladimir truly began his self-education in revolutionary thought. He became a voracious reader, devouring the works of radical Russian authors like Nikolai Chernyshevsky, whose novel What Is to Be Done would later inspire Lenin's own influential pamphlet of the same name. He also encountered the foundational text of his future ideology, Karl Marx's Das Kapital. This wasn't just casual reading, it was an immersion, a deep dive into the theoretical underpinnings of a worldview that offered an explanation for the injustices he perceived and a blueprint for a different future. Despite his expulsion, his undeniable intellect was recognized by sympathetic figures within the educational bureaucracy. He was eventually granted permission to study independently and, remarkably, took external law examinations at the University of St. Petersburg in 1891. He didn't just pass, he excelled, scoring top marks across the board, demonstrating a brilliant legal mind. He even briefly worked as a lawyer in Samara, representing impoverished peasants, a role that brought him face to face with the very real economic hardships of the Russian populace. But by this point, his primary focus had already shifted. The law was a means to an end, perhaps, but his true calling, his true passion, was the revolutionary movement. He wasn't interested in reforming the system. He was interested in dismantling it. This brings us to the next chapter of his life, the path to Marxism and first arrest, covering the years 1893 to 1900. In the autumn of 1893, Vladimir made a pivotal move to the imperial capital, St. Petersburg. This was a city in flux, a melting pot of industrial unrest and political ferment. The Russian Empire was undergoing rapid industrialization, a process that, while bringing economic change, also created a burgeoning but severely exploited urban working class. These factory workers, often living in squalid conditions and toiling for meager wages, became the fertile ground for Marxist ideas. In St. Petersburg, Vladimir quickly integrated himself into underground Marxist study circles. These weren't formal university seminars, they were clandestine gatherings, often held in secret, where individuals discussed and debated revolutionary theory. He rapidly rose to prominence, becoming a key figure in the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. This group aimed to bridge the gap between abstract Marxist theory and the concrete, daily economic struggles of the factory workers. Think of it like this. Marx provided the grand theoretical framework, the architectural plans for a new society. Lenin and his comrades were the engineers, trying to figure out how to lay the foundation and build the structure in the specific, challenging conditions of Tsarist Russia. It was during this period that he began to refine his distinct interpretation of Marxism, which would eventually become known as Leninism. This wasn't a passive acceptance of Marx's ideas. It was an active adaptation. Many of his contemporaries, following a more orthodox Marxist line, believed that Russia, a largely agrarian society, had to pass through a prolonged period of bourgeois capitalism, where the industrial working class would grow and develop its consciousness before a socialist revolution could occur. Lenin vehemently disagreed. He argued that the Russian working class, or proletariat, could bypass this prolonged capitalist stage. But to do so, they would need the guidance and leadership of a dedicated vanguard of professional revolutionaries. This idea of a vanguard party was a crucial departure, a recognition of Russia's unique circumstances and a blueprint for how a revolution could be accelerated. It suggested that the working class, left to its own devices, might not spontaneously develop the necessary revolutionary consciousness. It needed to be led. To evade the ever-present threat of the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, members of the League of Struggle used pseudonyms and aliases. It was during this time that Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov began to use the moniker Lenin. While the exact origin is debated, historians generally believe it's derived from the Lena River, perhaps symbolizing the vastness and harshness of Siberia, a place that would soon play a significant role in his life. It was a symbolic adoption, a shedding of his bourgeois past and an embrace of his revolutionary identity. Despite their clandestine efforts, the Okhrana was remarkably effective at infiltrating these underground networks. In December 1895, just before a major strike was planned, Lenin and several other key members of the League of Struggle were arrested. He spent over a year in solitary confinement in a St. Petersburg prison. This wasn't a period of idleness for Lenin. It was a time of intense intellectual activity. He used the time to write, to read, and ingeniously to communicate secretly with his comrades, using milk as invisible ink. This act alone speaks volumes about his dedication and resourcefulness, even under the most restrictive conditions. Following his imprisonment, in early 1897, the Tsarist authorities sentenced him to 3 years of internal exile in the remote Siberian village of Shushenskoye, located in the Minsk region. Now, when we hear Siberia, we often conjure images of gulags and brutal labor camps. However, for political exiles of this era, the conditions were relatively lenient, though still harsh by modern standards. Lenin was under police surveillance, but he was permitted a surprising degree of freedom. He could roam, hunt, swim in the Yenisei River, and crucially for an intellectual, receive visitors and correspondence. It was in Siberia that he solidified a critical, personal, and political partnership. He was joined by Nadezhda Krupskaya, a fellow Marxist and revolutionary educator whom he had met in St. Petersburg. Krupskaya herself had been arrested in 1896 for organizing a strike and was subsequently permitted to join Lenin in Shushenskoye. They were married in July 1898 in a local church, a requirement for her to remain with him. Krupskaya was far more than just Lenin's wife. She became his lifelong companion, his personal secretary, and one of his most trusted political confidants. Their partnership was a cornerstone of his revolutionary career, a testament to the fact that even the most driven individuals need allies and support. During his Siberian exile, Lenin was incredibly productive. He translated European socialist literature, corresponded extensively with other Russian Marxists, and wrote his first major theoretical work, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, 1899. This was a dense, meticulously researched study where he applied Marxist economic theory to argue that capitalism was, contrary to popular belief among some agrarian populists, already well established in the Russian countryside. This was a direct challenge to those who believed Russia could build socialism on the foundation of the traditional peasant commune, and it further cemented his reputation as a serious, analytical Marxist theorist. His Siberian exile ended in February 1900. By this point, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP, had been formally established, though its members were scattered, divided, and heavily surveilled. Lenin, with his keen organizational mind, immediately recognized a critical need: a unified ideological front and a centralized means of communication. He understood that without a coherent message and a way to disseminate it, the movement would remain fragmented and ineffective. So, he embarked on a journey across Europe to establish an underground newspaper. In late 1900, he launched Iskra, meaning the spark. This newspaper was a logistical marvel of revolutionary publishing. It was printed in various European cities, Munich, London, Geneva, and then meticulously smuggled into the Russian Empire by a network of dedicated revolutionaries. Iskra wasn't just a newspaper, it was the ideological backbone of the nascent Russian Marxist movement. It allowed Lenin to establish his authority, disseminate his ideas, and outline his vision for a centralized, disciplined party. It was the glue that held the scattered revolutionary cells together, providing them with a common voice and a shared purpose. This period also saw the publication of one of Lenin's most influential political pamphlets, What Is to Be Done, in 1902. The title, as mentioned, was a nod to Chernyshevsky, but the content was uniquely Lenin's. In this text, he laid out a controversial but ultimately defining argument that the working class, if left to its own devices, would only develop trade union consciousness. What did he mean by that? He meant they would focus on immediate economic improvements, better wages, shorter hours, improved working conditions, rather than pursuing a broader political revolution aimed at overthrowing the entire capitalist system. To achieve true socialism, Lenin argued, revolutionary consciousness had to be brought to the workers from outside, by an elite vanguard of dedicated, professional revolutionaries who possessed a deep understanding of Marxist theory. This wasn't about spontaneous mass uprising, it was about organized, disciplined leadership. This concept was a fundamental departure from some orthodox Marxist views, and became the organizational blueprint for the future Bolshevik Party. It was, in essence, a call for a highly centralized, disciplined, and ideologically pure party to lead the masses. These ideological formulations were not just abstract theories. They were put to the test at the Second Congress of the RSDLP, which convened in Brussels in July 1903 and later moved to London. The Congress was intended to unite the various Russian Marxist factions. Instead, it exposed deep, irreconcilable fractures. On one side was Lenin's vision of a small, disciplined, and highly centralized party, a vanguard that would lead the revolution. On the other side was the more moderate approach favored by figures like Julius Martov, who advocated for a broader, mass-based party, more akin to Western European social democratic parties, open to a wider range of members and opinions. The debate was fierce, and it came to a head during the latter half of the Congress, when a number of moderate delegates walked out. This walkout, ironically, gave Lenin's faction a slight majority on the party's Central Committee and the editorial board of Iskra. Lenin, a master of political maneuvering and propaganda, seized on this numerical advantage. He immediately dubbed his supporters the Bolsheviks, derived from the Russian word for majority, and labeled his opponents the Mensheviks, from the Russian word for minority. This semantic victory was immensely powerful. By defining his faction as the majority, even if it was a slim and temporary one, Lenin was able to frame his supporters as the true representatives of the working class, the authentic voice of the revolution. It was a brilliant rhetorical stroke that stuck. This split caused a decade of intense factional fighting within the RSDLP. Lenin spent the years following the 1903 Congress relentlessly defending Bolshevism, writing extensively, and organizing party structures. The tensions came to a head at the Third Congress of the RSDLP, held in London in 1905, which the Mensheviks largely boycotted. This boycott allowed Lenin to cement the Bolshevik faction as an independent organization, further solidifying his control and his vision for the party. Just as these internal party struggles were unfolding, external events in Russia provided an unexpected jolt. The year 1905 brought immense upheaval to the Russian Empire. Defeated in the disastrous Russo-Japanese War and plagued by widespread economic hardship, the populace finally rose up in a wave of protests, strikes, and mutinies. The catalyst was Bloody Sunday in January, when Tsar's troops fired on peaceful protesters in St. Petersburg, severely damaging the public's perception of Tsar Nicholas II. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a spark that ignited a nationwide conflagration. As the unrest spread, Lenin, ever the astute observer of revolutionary situations, realized that the conditions for an uprising were developing. In November 1905, he clandestinely returned to St. Petersburg to guide the Bolsheviks. During this period, he wasn't advocating for peaceful protest. He was advocating for armed uprising. He urged party members to form militias, construct barricades, and take advantage of the chaos to seize power. He saw it as a dress rehearsal for the main event. However, Lenin, for all his strategic brilliance, underestimated the resilience of the Tsarist regime. Tsar Nicholas II, under immense pressure, issued the October Manifesto, which granted civil liberties and established a legislative assembly, the State Duma. This act effectively pacified the liberal elements of the opposition, who saw it as a step towards constitutional monarchy. By early 1906, the Tsarist government had regained control and brutally crushed the worker uprisings in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The revolution of 1905, while a significant precursor, ultimately failed. In the aftermath of this failed revolution, Lenin was forced to flee the Russian Empire once again. He began a second period of European exile that would last for more than a decade. It was a difficult and often demoralizing time for the revolutionary movement. The Tsarist government cracked down heavily on radicals, leading to a decline in party membership and a rise in disillusioned intellectuals turning away from politics. It was a period of reaction, a time when the dreams of 1905 seemed to recede into the distance. During these years of reaction, Lenin lived primarily in Switzerland and Paris. He didn't retreat from politics. Instead, he engaged in fierce ideological battles within the broader socialist movement. He continued his fight against the Mensheviks, who, chastened by the failure of 1905, wanted to abandon underground revolutionary work and operate legally within the Duma, seeing it as a path to gradual reform. Lenin saw this as a betrayal of revolutionary principles. He also battled within his own Bolshevik faction, refuting ultra-left members who wanted to boycott the Duma entirely, which Lenin also saw as politically short-sighted. He also fought against philosophers within his party, whom he accused of deviating from strict Marxist materialism, highlighting his unwavering commitment to ideological purity. To ensure the Bolsheviks remained a distinct and disciplined force, Lenin took concrete steps. In 1911, he established a party school in Longjumeau, near Paris, where he trained a new cadre of young revolutionaries who would become loyal followers. This was an investment in the future, a recognition that the party needed dedicated, ideologically sound individuals to carry on the struggle. He also founded a new daily newspaper, Pravda, The Truth, in 1912. Crucially, Pravda was published legally in St. Petersburg, making it a vital tool for communicating directly with the Russian working class, bypassing the clandestine networks of the past. These actions demonstrate Lenin's strategic foresight and his relentless commitment to building the organizational and ideological infrastructure of his party, even in exile. Then came World War I, a cataclysmic event that profoundly impacted Lenin and the international socialist movement. The outbreak of war in 1914 presented an existential crisis for socialists worldwide. Prior to the war, European socialist parties had, in theory, pledged to unite across borders and oppose any capitalist, imperialist conflict. The idea was that workers of the world had no country, and they should not fight each other for the benefit of their capitalist masters. However, when war erupted, the vast majority of socialist parties in Germany, France, and Britain abandoned this internationalist stance. They supported their respective national governments, voting for war credits, essentially endorsing the conflict. The Second International, the global organization of socialist parties, collapsed under the weight of nationalism. Lenin, residing in neutral Switzerland at the time, was absolutely horrified by this perceived betrayal. He saw it not just as a failure of principles, but as a profound ideological capitulation. He denounced the socialist leaders who supported the war as social chauvinists, accusing them of prioritizing nationalistic loyalty over class solidarity, and called for a complete break with them. He believed that the war was not a war for national defense, but an imperialist war, driven by the competition among capitalist powers. During this period of isolation, Lenin dedicated himself to intense writing and theoretical development. In 1916, he published Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. This was a seminal work where he argued that capitalism had evolved into a new, global phase. He posited that competition among monopoly capitalist businesses had led to the division of the world among the major imperialist powers, and that the war was a direct, inevitable result of these imperialist rivalries. He also advanced a controversial but influential idea that capitalism had become parasitic, using super profits extracted from colonial empires to bribe the upper layers of the working class in the West. This, he argued, explained their support for the war and their lack of revolutionary fervor. It was a way of explaining why the working class in industrialized nations hadn't risen up, as Marx had predicted. Lenin concluded from this analysis that the imperialist war would inevitably lead to a global crisis, a breakdown of the capitalist system, which could and should be transformed into a civil war and a proletarian revolution. He famously championed the slogan, "Turn the imperialist war into a civil war." This wasn't just a call to action. It was a theoretical justification for using the chaos and destruction of the global conflict as an opportunity for revolutionary change. Perhaps his most significant political work of this period was The State and Revolution, written in 1917, while he was still in hiding. In this text, Lenin analyzed the nature of the state, arguing unequivocally that it was an instrument of class oppression, a tool used by the ruling class to maintain its power over the exploited. He rejected the reformist view that the working class could simply take control of the existing bourgeois state apparatus and use it for their own ends. Instead, he argued that the proletariat needed to smash the old state machine, dismantle its institutions, and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat to suppress the resistance of the exploiters. This was not a temporary measure. It was a necessary phase to consolidate revolutionary power. The book also outlined his ultimate vision of a communist society where eventually, as classes disappeared, the state itself would wither away, becoming obsolete. It was a powerful, uncompromising vision of revolutionary transformation. The theoretical groundwork was laid, and then, in early 1917, the impossible happened. The strain of World War I, severe food shortages, and economic collapse finally triggered the February Revolution in Russia. Spontaneous protests and strikes erupted in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, which had been renamed during the war due to its German-sounding name. The Tsar's military garrison mutinied, refusing to fire on the protesters, and Tsar Nicholas II was ultimately forced to abdicate, bringing an end to the Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries. A provisional government, largely composed of liberal and moderate politicians, was established to run the country. But simultaneously, the Petrograd Soviet, a council representing workers and soldiers, was formed, creating a situation of dual power. You had the official government, and then you had this unofficial but incredibly influential body representing the revolutionary masses. This was a volatile, unstable situation. Lenin was still in exile in Zurich when the news reached him. He was desperate to return to Russia, to seize this unprecedented revolutionary opportunity. But travel through war-torn Europe was nearly impossible. Here's where a truly extraordinary and controversial decision was made. Recognizing the potential for a socialist revolution to further destabilize its enemy, the German government agreed to provide a sealed train for Lenin and a group of other revolutionaries to travel through Germany to neutral Sweden, from where they could then travel to Russia. This decision by the German government to allow the plague bacillus of Bolshevism, as Churchill famously called it, into Russia would have monumental historical consequences. It was a gamble that paid off for Germany in the short term by knocking Russia out of the war, but it unleashed forces that would reshape the entire 20th century. Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd in April 1917, after a decade of exile. He was met by a crowd of ecstatic supporters and immediately delivered a fiery speech that shocked even his closest Bolshevik comrades. The very next day, he published what became known as the April Theses. These were not gentle suggestions. They were a radical declaration of intent. In the April Theses, Lenin argued that the February Revolution had simply transferred power from the Tsar to the bourgeoisie, and that Russia was now ripe for a second socialist revolution. He called for no support for the provisional government, a direct challenge to the existing authority. He demanded that all state power be transferred to the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers. He also called for an immediate end to World War I, the nationalization of all land, and the restructuring of the party. Initially, Lenin's radical proposals were met with considerable skepticism by many Bolshevik leaders. They too were more orthodox Marxists, who believed that Russia was not economically developed enough for socialism, and that the provisional government had to be supported through a bourgeois democratic phase before a socialist revolution could occur. They thought Lenin was out of touch, too extreme. However, Lenin's immense rhetorical force, his unwavering political will, and his ability to appeal directly to the radicalized workers and soldiers eventually won the party over to his position. He was relentless, persuasive, and tapped into the deep discontent that was simmering in the streets and barracks. By the summer of 1917, the political situation in Russia remained highly unstable. The provisional government, now under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky, yes, the son of Lenin's old school director, continued to pursue the deeply unpopular war, leading to further military disasters and economic hardship. The patience of the people was wearing thin. In July, massive, spontaneous protests broke out in Petrograd. Armed workers and soldiers, utterly frustrated with the ongoing crisis, took to the streets, demanding all power to the Soviets. This event, known as the July Days, was a critical juncture. The Bolshevik leadership initially attempted to restrain the protesters, realizing that a premature uprising could lead to the destruction of the party. They were still building their strength, but ultimately, they joined the movement to give it direction and harness its energy. The provisional government used the opportunity to crack down hard on the Bolsheviks. They claimed the party was acting as a German agent, a charge that had some basis given Lenin's sealed train journey, and ordered the arrest of its leaders. Bolshevik offices were raided, and Pravda was shut down. Lenin, who was in Petrograd during the protests, was forced to go into hiding once again. To avoid arrest, he shaved his beard, wore a wig, and assumed the disguise of a Finnish worker. He secretly fled Petrograd, making his way to the shores of Lake Rosliv, where he lived in a makeshift hut made of branches. He later crossed the border into the Grand Duchy of Finland, remaining hidden in the towns of Jalkala and Helsinki. While in hiding, Lenin continued to direct the Bolshevik Party through clandestine letters and messengers. It was during this period of intense isolation and reflection that he wrote The State and Revolution, refining his theoretical lens on the mechanics of a socialist state. And crucially, he began to push the Bolshevik Central Committee to prepare for an armed insurrection. He argued that the peaceful development of the revolution was no longer possible, that the provisional government was too weak and the people too radicalized. The time to seize power had arrived. By the autumn of 1917, Lenin's assessment proved correct. The Kerensky-led provisional government was truly on the verge of collapse. The economy was in ruins, the military was disintegrating due to mass desertions, and a right-wing military coup led by General Lavur Kornilov had threatened the capital in August. This crisis, ironically, forced Kerensky to arm the workers and the Bolshevik Red Guards for defense, a maneuver that greatly enhanced the prestige and military capability of the very party that would soon overthrow him. In October, Lenin secretly returned to Petrograd, his disguise now more crucial than ever. The Bolshevik Central Committee met on October 10th, and after a tense debate, approved Lenin's resolution to launch an armed uprising. The timing was crucial. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was scheduled to convene in late October, and Lenin wanted to ensure that the Bolsheviks could present the Congress with a fait accompli, a revolutionary act already accomplished, transferring power to the Soviets, but under firm Bolshevik control. On the night of October 24th to 25th, according to the old Julian calendar, November 6th to 7th in the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks initiated their coup. The seizure of power in the capital itself was surprisingly bloodless. Red Guards, sailors, and soldiers loyal to the Bolsheviks systematically captured key strategic points across Petrograd, including railway stations, telephone exchanges, and the state bank. It was a meticulously planned, almost surgical operation. The provisional government's headquarters at the Winter Palace was surrounded. Following a symbolic blank shot fired from the cruiser Aurora, the building was stormed, and the ministers of the provisional government were arrested. Kerensky, the son of Lenin's old school director, fled the city to seek military reinforcements, ultimately without success. The old order had fallen. The following day, Lenin made a public appearance at the Congress of Soviets to announce the transfer of power. The Mensheviks and moderate socialist revolutionaries, furious at what they saw as an undemocratic coup, condemned the act and walked out of the Congress. This walkout was a critical miscalculation. It left Lenin and the Bolsheviks in control. allowing them to pass decrees transferring land to the peasants, proposing an immediate democratic peace to all warring nations, and establishing a new government, the Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom, with Lenin as its chairman. The October Revolution was complete, and a new era had begun. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 was, however, only the beginning of a much larger struggle. Lenin's new government faced monumental challenges: economic ruin, a collapsing military, widespread opposition, and a country exhausted by war. One of Lenin's primary promises to the Russian people had been to end World War I. Realizing that the Russian army was utterly incapable of fighting the Germans, Lenin ordered the opening of peace negotiations. However, the German demands were incredibly harsh, requiring Russia to cede vast territories, including Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states, and to pay heavy indemnities. This was not a peace of equals, it was a dictated peace. A fierce debate erupted within the Bolshevik Party. Some leaders, such as Nikolayevich, advocated for a revolutionary war, believing that signing an imperialist peace would betray the international socialist revolution. They felt Russia should continue fighting to spark revolutions elsewhere. Lenin, however, took a brutally pragmatic stance. He argued that the survival of the socialist state in Russia was the absolute priority. Without a cessation of hostilities, the Bolshevik regime would be overthrown. He understood that you can't build socialism if your state is being crushed by foreign armies. After intense political maneuvering and threats of resignation, Lenin secured the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. The treaty resulted in immense territorial and economic losses for Russia, but it achieved Lenin's goal of securing breathing space for the revolution, allowing the new government to consolidate its power. Domestically, Lenin moved rapidly to consolidate the Bolshevik dictatorship. In late 1917, he established the Cheka, an all-Russian extraordinary commission to combat counter-revolution, sabotage, and speculation. The Cheka quickly became an organ of political terror, operating outside the law to suppress any real or perceived enemies of the state. This was not about due process, it was about protecting the revolution by any means necessary. In January 1918, Lenin took another decisive step against democratic opposition. Elections for the Constituent Assembly had been held before the October Revolution, and the Bolsheviks won less than a quarter of the vote, with the Socialist revolutionaries winning a majority. When the assembly met, Lenin had it dissolved by force after a single day, arguing that the Soviet system, under Bolshevik control, was a higher and more democratic form of representation than a bourgeois parliament. This effectively closed the door to multi-party democracy in Russia, cementing a one-party state. For Lenin, the will of the revolutionary vanguard, expressed through the Soviets, superseded any traditional parliamentary democracy. The signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, and the radical economic policies of the Bolsheviks alienated large segments of the population. By the summer of 1918, Russia was plunged into a brutal and devastating civil war. Lenin's government was opposed by a loose coalition known as the White Army, composed of monarchists, liberals, capitalists, and even moderate socialists who opposed the Bolshevik dictatorship. To complicate matters further, they were aided by foreign interventionist forces from Great Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, who feared the spread of global communism and sought to prop up the anti-Bolshevik forces. This wasn't just an internal struggle, it was a proxy war on a global scale. The survival of the Bolshevik regime, now renamed the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks, during the Civil War, required ruthless policies and extreme centralization, a period known as War Communism. Lenin ordered the nationalization of all major industries, the militarization of labor, and the suppression of the free market. The economy was geared entirely towards supporting the war effort. To feed the Red Army and the urban population, the government implemented a policy of grain requisitioning, or prodrazvirska, forcibly seizing surplus grain, and often essential seed grain, from the peasantry. This policy, while necessary to prevent starvation in the cities and feed the army, led to widespread peasant revolts, which were brutally crushed by the Cheka and the Red Army. It was a desperate measure that created immense suffering and resentment in the countryside. During the darkest hours of the Civil War, in July 1918, Lenin authorized the execution of the former Tsar, Nicholas II, and his entire family in Yekaterinburg. This brutal act was carried out to prevent them from becoming a rallying symbol for the white forces, a stark demonstration of the regime's ruthlessness. Lenin himself became a target. In August 1918, he survived an assassination attempt. Following a speech at a Moscow factory, he was shot and severely wounded by Fanny Kaplan, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. The assassination attempt, which left 2 bullets lodged in his body, further exacerbated the paranoia of the Bolshevik leadership and led to a dramatic intensification of the Red Terror, a systematic campaign of mass arrests and executions against political opponents, striking workers, and suspected counter-revolutionaries. It was a period of extreme violence, an attempt to cleanse the country of all opposition. Despite operating under immense strain, Lenin's strategic direction, combined with the military organization of Leon Trotsky, who built the Red Army from scratch into a formidable fighting force, allowed the Bolsheviks to survive. By the end of 1920, the main white armies had been defeated, and the foreign interventionists had withdrawn. The Bolsheviks had won the Civil War, but at an unimaginable cost. While the Bolsheviks emerged victorious from the Civil War, the country they ruled was in ruins. Years of conflict, combined with the disastrous policies of war communism, have led to economic collapse, widespread famine, and societal devastation. Industrial production had plummeted, transportation networks were broken, and agricultural output was a mere fraction of pre-war levels. The victory felt hollow for many. In early 1921, the crisis reached a breaking point. Widespread worker strikes paralyzed major cities, and the discontent spread to the military. In March 1921, the sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, who had previously been staunch supporters of the Bolsheviks, known as the pride and glory of the revolution, mutinied, demanding free elections, freedom of speech, and the end of Bolshevik dictatorship. This was an internal revolt, a rebellion from within the very heart of the revolution, and it was the most severe crisis the party had yet faced. Lenin recognized the gravity of the situation. He took decisive military action, ordering Trotsky to crush the Kronstadt rebellion, which resulted in thousands of casualties. But he also realized that military force alone was not enough to solve the underlying problems. The country was starving, and the people were exhausted. At the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, Lenin made a dramatic and pragmatic shift in economic policy, introducing the New Economic Policy, or NEP. The NEP represented a partial strategic return to state-regulated capitalism. It abolished the hated grain requisitioning system, replacing it with a more manageable tax-in-kind. Crucially, peasants were now allowed to sell their surplus grain on the open market, providing an incentive for production. Furthermore, small-scale businesses, retail trade, and light industry were denationalized and allowed to operate privately. The state, however, retained control of the commanding heights of the economy, including heavy industry, banking, and foreign trade. The NEP was initially met with shock and resistance from many orthodox Bolsheviks, who viewed it as a betrayal of socialist principles, a retreat into capitalism. Lenin defended the policy as a temporary strategic retreat, arguing that it was necessary to revive the agricultural sector, rebuild the alliance, Smichka, with the peasantry, and provide the economic foundation for future socialist development. He famously called it one step backward, 2 steps forward. The NEP was a remarkable success, quickly stabilizing the economy, ending the famine, and dramatically improving the standard of living for millions. It was a testament to Lenin's pragmatism and his ability to adapt his ideology when faced with existential threats. While Lenin was willing to compromise on economic policy, he was utterly uncompromising regarding political control. During the later years of his life, even as his health began to fail, He oversaw the further centralization of the state and the suppression of internal dissent within the Communist Party. At the very same 10th Party Congress in 1921, where the NEP was introduced, Lenin pushed through a resolution banning factions within the Communist Party. This was a critical development, as it outlawed organized political opposition groups within the party ranks, ensuring ideological conformity and concentrating power in the hands of the party's central leadership. It effectively meant that once a decision was made, all party members had to abide by it, regardless of their previous opinions. This move, designed to prevent the party from fracturing, ironically laid the groundwork for the extreme authoritarianism that would follow. Another major issue during this period was the structure of the new state. Following the October Revolution, various independent Soviet republics were established in the territories of the former Russian Empire, such as Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus. A debate ensued regarding how these republics should be integrated with Soviet Russia. Lenin advocated for a federation of equal, sovereign republics. He clashed significantly with Joseph Stalin, who was the Commissar for Nationalities, and favored a policy of autonomization, which would see the various republics incorporated directly into the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, essentially making them subordinate to Moscow. After a fierce ideological struggle, Lenin, even in his declining health, intervened and forced a compromise, which ultimately led to the formal creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, in December 1922. This was a monumental achievement, establishing the formal structure of the new Soviet state, even if the promise of equal sovereign republics would later be undermined. The physical strain of decades of revolutionary activity, the immense stress of the Civil War, and the lingering effects of the 1918 assassination attempt took a severe toll on Lenin's health. Beginning in 1921, he began suffering from severe headaches, fatigue, and insomnia. The man who had driven himself relentlessly for so long was finally breaking down. In May 1922, Lenin suffered his first major stroke. The stroke left him paralyzed on his right side and severely impaired his ability to speak. He took a leave of absence from his government duties to recover in the countryside estate of Gorky, near Moscow. Despite his declining health, Lenin continued to follow political developments with a keen eye and became increasingly alarmed by the direction the party was taking. He was particularly concerned about the growing bureaucratization of the state apparatus, the creeping inefficiency and arrogance of the new Soviet bureaucracy, and most importantly, the rise of Joseph Stalin, who had been appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. This position, initially seen as a purely administrative role, gave Stalin immense power over party appointments and organization. Lenin's relationship with Stalin deteriorated significantly during this period. Stalin had behaved aggressively toward Georgian communist leaders, a situation that deeply offended Lenin, who accused Stalin of great Russian chauvinism, a dangerous reemergence of old imperialistic attitudes. Furthermore, Stalin had been personally rude to Krupskaya, Lenin's wife and closest confidant, an insult Lenin took as a direct attack on himself. These personal slights, combined with his growing political concerns, cemented Lenin's distrust of Stalin. In late 1922 and early 1923, from his sickbed, Lenin dictated a series of notes and articles that have come to be known as his testament. In these crucial writings, Lenin evaluated the leading members of the Communist Party, offering critical assessments of his potential successors. He described Trotsky as the most capable man in the Central Committee, but criticized him for his excessive self-confidence and preoccupation with administration. But his most significant criticism was reserved for Stalin. He specifically criticized Stalin as having concentrated too much power in his hands, suggesting that the party should remove him from the position of General Secretary. Lenin, it seems, recognized the inherent danger of the bureaucratic power that Stalin was amassing. Lenin's notes were meant to be read at the upcoming 12th Party Congress, but due to his rapidly declining health and the shrewd maneuvering of Stalin's allies, they were largely suppressed and kept hidden from the broader party membership. It was a crucial moment in Soviet history, a lost opportunity to potentially alter the course of succession. In March 1923, Lenin suffered a third stroke, which robbed him of his speech entirely and left him an invalid, unable to participate in political life. He spent his final months at Gorky, cared for by Krupskaya and his sister, largely detached from the political world he had so profoundly shaped. On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Lenin suffered a final, catastrophic stroke and died at the age of 53. The death of Lenin sent shockwaves throughout the Soviet Union and the international communist movement. The Soviet government officially announced his death the following day, sparking an outpouring of grief and national mourning. In a controversial decision, the party leadership, spearheaded by Stalin, decided to embalm Lenin's body and place it in a temporary wooden mausoleum on Red Square in Moscow. A permanent granite mausoleum was completed in 1930. The preservation and public display of Lenin's body were used to create a quasi-religious cult of personality, elevating him to the status of the infallible founding father of the Soviet state. This was not just a memorial, it was a political act, designed to legitimize the new regime and its leaders by associating them with the revered figure of Lenin. In connection with his death, the city of Petrograd was renamed Leningrad in his honor, a name it held until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Lenin's legacy is complex, multifaceted, and the subject of intense historical debate, even today. To his supporters and the official Soviet historiography, he was a brilliant revolutionary strategist, a devoted Marxist, and a liberator of the working class who translated complex theory into the creation of the world's first socialist state. His pragmatic adaptations of Marxism, particularly the concept of the Vanguard Party and the NEP, provided the organizational blueprint for numerous 20th-century socialist and national liberation movements across the globe. He was seen as the architect of a new world, a visionary who dared to challenge the established order. To his critics and many Western historians, however, Lenin was a dogmatic, ruthless politician who laid the groundwork for a totalitarian regime. They argue that his decision to dissolve the Constituent Assembly, his suppression of political opposition, and his use of state terror through the Cheka created an apparatus of repression that was later expanded and perfected by his successor, Joseph Stalin. They see him not as a liberator, but as the progenitor of a system that would lead to immense suffering and loss of life. Regardless of the perspective, Vladimir Lenin remains one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century. His theoretical writings and political actions fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape, reshaping the map of Europe and establishing an ideological system that would define global politics for decades. Even today, his ideas and the historical trajectory of the state he founded continue to be studied, debated, and analyzed by historians and political scientists worldwide. So what can we take away from this journey through Lenin's life? Several key themes emerge. First, the profound impact of personal tragedy and early life experiences on shaping a revolutionary's worldview. For Lenin, the execution of his brother was a crucible that forged his anti-Tsarist convictions. Second, the power of intellectual conviction and strategic adaptation. Lenin wasn't just a theorist, he was a pragmatist who adapted Marxist theory to the specific conditions of Russia, creating Leninism, which became a potent force. His concept of the Vanguard Party, his use of Iskra and Pravda to build a unified movement, and his tactical genius in seizing power during the October Revolution all highlight this. Third, the brutal realities of revolution and state building. The Civil War, war communism, the Red Terror, and the suppression of democratic institutions like the Constituent Assembly demonstrate the ruthless measures Lenin was willing to employ to consolidate power and defend the revolution. He was uncompromising in his political control, even if he could be flexible in economic policy with the NEP. Finally, his declining health and his warnings about Stalin serve as a poignant reminder of the unpredictable nature of power and succession, and how even the most powerful figures can lose control over the forces they unleash. Lenin's story is a testament to the idea that ideas, when combined with ruthless will and opportune circumstances, can move mountains, or in this case, overthrow empires and establish entirely new political systems. His legacy continues to challenge us, forcing us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about means and ends, about the sacrifices made in the name of a better future, and about the enduring allure and dangers of revolutionary change. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of history's most pivotal figures.